Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I hope you're doing very well, and we're all going to have a fantastic 2025, I know we are, and hugs to each and every one of you. And actually, the story I'm going to read you today has a bit of a Christmas spirit to it, perhaps I should have read it over the Christmas season. But anyway, here we go, and you're going to love every minute of this story because it really is a special story. But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, 12-year-old Karen Wheaton stared out of the cabin window at a white ethereal winter wonderland that stretched out before her like a spectacular heartwarming Christmas card. She couldn't help but feel that if all the snow-covered Christmas trees were bountifully arranged with colourful Christmas baubles and a plethora of silvery tinsel, the sight before her eyes would become even more perfect. But she reasoned it would be quite a laborious job to decorate all the trees in the woodgrove with tinsel and Christmas baubles. It would be such a mammoth project to undertake that would make turning the Christmas lights on in Madison Square Gardens seem like a breeze. Still, you could dream, couldn't you? And Karen had provided herself in having a great imagination that had served her well as a little girl, when she had no brothers and sisters to play with. Back in those days she had created her own invisible friends for herself, so she never ever had to feel alone. Karen Wheaton may have only been 12 years old, but she'd never tired of the extraordinary visual beauty of the Alaskan wilderness, and was used to the snow-covered scene that greeted her every year like an old friend, when once again she arrived at her grandparents' cabin, sometimes with her mother Zelda at her side, and other times completely on her own, depending of course on whether her mother had been given time off for Christmas, as her mother was an ER doctor working in accident and emergency, and sometimes her mother was expected to work over the Christmas season, which was something that Karen was well used to by now, so she never complained about it. Karen adored coming to Alaska for the Christmas season year after year to spend quality time with her grandparents, which she wouldn't have missed for all the world. Every year Karen would eagerly charter a flight from Pennsylvania to Anchorage, where an independent bush plane would fly her out to her grandparents' cabin that was out in the middle of nowhere. And that made the experience seem all the more magical to her, because she felt so thrilled to be far away from everything, almost as if her grandparents, the cabin, and the snow-covered wilderness set out before her were all their own little secret world. Karen would quickly forget the hustle and bustle of city life back in Pennsylvania, as she happily settled down to a much more serene existence in the Alaskan wilderness with her grandparents. So for her, returning home after the Christmas sabbatical was quite the struggle. If she'd been given a choice, she'd have happily stayed with her grandparents forever. Karen was the first to understand why her grandparents had sought out this rather unorthodox way of living for themselves, even though her mother Zelda understood none of this senseless reasoning. And 10 years on, she still hadn't acclimatized to the fact that both her parents were now living in Alaska for the foreseeable future, with no intentions of returning to life in suburbia. Karen's mother Zelda had grown up in a delightful, charming, affluent area in Pennsylvania known as Chestnut Hill, which boasted cobbled streets and historic charm, where she'd been raised by her devoted, fun-loving parents, who had made sure that Zelda had wanted for nothing. They had worked exceedingly hard on her account to send her to the very best schools and universities, sacrificing much on her behalf. But when her parents finally retired, it was her father Elk's quintessential dream to move to the Alaskan wilderness. Elk Wheaton was the kind of man, when he said he was going to do something, he usually did it, for he was not willing to give up on his dreams. Over the years he had busted his guts to raise enough money to accommodate those wistful dreams of his that he was determined to one day turn into a reality. When Zelda Wheaton was growing up, her father had talked tirelessly about his retirement years, with the same kind of enthusiastic conviction, impassioned zealousness, and wistful longing that a kid might express when talking about what he or she wanted for Christmas the following year. Elk Wheaton would rub his long wispy greying beard, giving it a few affectionate tugs, and longingly say, "When I get into my late 50s, or possibly early 60s, me and your mother, Zelda, we are going to leave Chestnut Hill for good. I know this is a charming place to live, and we've been very happy here. But me and your mother would love to live in Alaska." He had addressed his daughter warmly and said, "Of course, Zelda, you would be welcome to join me and your mother on our Alaskan adventure. But I rather think by then you will have flown the nest and chased after a medical career, if I'm not wrong." For Zelda had talked tirelessly from the age of 9 about how one day she was going to become a doctor and focus on making people well again. Elk rather suspected that a sanctuary like Alaska would never be exciting enough for someone like Zelda, but he told her that should she wish to join them on their adventure, she was more than welcome to do so. Zelda would raise a doubtful brow and say, "Yeah, right, you're going to move to Alaska, are you, when you retire?" "I don't think so, Dad," she'd say, shaking her head furiously, for she hadn't believed a word of it. Even though she was well aware of the fact that Elk Wheaton, her ungovernable, strong-willed, very obstinate father, who was both headstrong and determined, was not the kind of man that would say things off the cuff for no reason at all. Zelda's mother Dora would say, "Why are you so sceptical, love? I can see you don't believe a word of what your father is saying. But he's being deadly serious about moving to Alaska, you know. But if you must know, Zelda, me and your father started saving for this Alaskan adventure long before you were even born. That is why your father has worked so passionately hard over the years and sacrificed so very much. We will move to Alaska one day, you know. It's exactly what will happen, as suburban living isn't for us, as lovely as it is around here. But the only reason we live here in Chestnut Hill is for your father's work. And of course it's been the quintessential opportunity to send you to great schools. But when the time is right, Alaska is definitely our new future." Zelda had thought it was all pie in the sky, of course, and wishful thinking on her parents' part. It would seem her father was an idealistic romantic at heart, and her mother was no better. But moving to Alaska was a very impractical decision that she was sure would never come about, especially not when her parents turned 60. She was certain by the time they got older, they would realize it would be a ridiculous, unfeasible dream to move to Alaska. She would, of course, be the first to admit that her father Elk was an outdoorsy person who loved nature and the indigenous wildlife of the Americas. If the truth be told, Elk Wheaton had looked all wrong, dressed up in a designer navy blue pinstripe suit, with a starched shirt and silk tie to go to work every day at the offices in town, where he worked as a highly esteemed, successful attorney, who was bringing in a sizable, very attractive income, and driving around in a white Mercedes that really didn't suit him, for Elk Wheaton would have looked so much more at home in an off-road, robust vehicle that was as rugged and carefree as he actually was. On the weekends, when Elk Wheaton wore jeans and casual shirts rolled up at the sleeves, he looked a lot more comfortable in his own skin, rather like a snake that has shed its old skin that was way too tight for it and embraced a much better-fitting one. Somehow Elk Wheaton didn't look good, trussed up to the nines like a Thanksgiving turkey, as he always looked so much better, wearing that relaxed look that is so typically seen in outdoorsy Alaskan men, of which Elk Wheaton would one day become. When Zelda had been growing up, the Wheaton family spent many a holiday camping outdoors in remote places well off the beaten track, and her parents had thrived on these ambitious holidays, whitewater rafting, fishing, hunting, and anything else besides. But moving to Alaska to live in the wilderness seemed like an altogether overly ambitious project for two people embracing their retirement years. Zelda emphatically believed that most people, when they chose to retire, usually did so with a wise, rather scrupulous head on their shoulders, and chose to settle down to a less challenging, more relaxed way of life, probably moving to somewhere like the coast, where they would be able to enjoy leisurely walks on the beach with their dogs. But moving to Alaska was not for the faint of heart by any manner of means, and Zelda was absolutely sure that when push finally came to shove, her parents would never go through with such a preposterous, nonsensical idea. But she was the one who would quickly learn how wrong she'd been about all of this. Lo and behold, Zelda Wheaton was in for the shock of her life when her parents' Alaskan dream, which she always falsely believed, was like a dying sapling in the front yard that you never paid close attention to, had just burst into bloom. Ostensibly, Zelda Wheaton had completely underestimated her parents' dream and thrown it to the wayside like a discarded packet of chips, when the reality was her parents had been true to their word, steadfast in their intentions and unflinching in their determination to turn their dream into a reality, as it would seem you are never too old to dream, despite what others may think. It was at Elk Wheaton's 60th birthday party celebration, where the family had hosted a fabulous party at a glamorous venue, where there were ice sculptures, a delicious buffet, a fire eater, a couple of acrobats, including plenty of dancing for all the guests. It was during the formal speeches that Elk Wheaton announced to all his guests, and his daughter Zelda, of course, that he'd bought a remote cabin in Alaska, and he and his wife Dora would be moving there for good. And he told his friends that they were welcome to visit if they wanted to enjoy an adventure a little on the wild side, where the Wheatons would be living off-grid. While friends applauded them for their intrepid plans and wished them well, it would seem clandestinely behind the scenes, no one believed Elk or his wife Dora had what it took to live in the Alaskan wilderness, despite being outdoors enthusiasts. But 10 years on, the couple were happier than they'd ever been, and had no desire to return to their former suburban life, back in Chestnut Hill. So it seemed everyone had got the Wheatons dead wrong, most especially their daughter Zelda. Looking back, Zelda Wheaton had admitted that she was guilty of being one of the biggest naysayers, secretly believing her parents were off their rocker, and she had unabashedly, rather candidly, told her father as much. Zelda Wheaton happened to be one of those people that outwardly was very undiplomatic and somewhat tactless, always expressing her feelings on things, with not much of a filter. Sometimes she could come across as being rather too blunt. "Dad," she had said after he had announced the big news to all and sundry, "I know you've talked tirelessly all your life about moving to Alaska, but while in theory it sounds perfect, it's not an easy life, especially the way you and Mum want to live off-grid in the middle of nowhere. If you ask me, that's sheer lunacy. Do you have any idea what you're actually taking on? No, I don't think you do. It would be much better if you lived closer to Juneau or Anchorage. I might then give this impassioned wild idea of yours some credence. But moving out to live in the middle of the sticks is a step too far for the both of you. And then buying a cabin like this out of the blue without even seeing the place, well, I'm sorry, it's insane. It's like attempting to climb Mount Everest without being physically equipped to do so. And what, Dad, if it all ends up in failure?"
"Why are you so dreadfully sceptical, love, of a dream I've had since I was a child?"
her father had teased.
"I'm financially secure now. I've worked damned hard over the years for this, so that me and your mother can afford to move. We can now do what we've longed to do since we first got married. I'm not naive, of course. It's going to be hard, but life would be pretty mundane without challenges along the way, don't you think? I, for one, intend to embrace them all every step of the way, with wide open arms. Bring it on, I say."
"But Dad, look at other couples your age. They don't just randomly decide to jump in the deep end and dive in with the sharks, which is what you and Mum are actually doing. I'm sorry, but it is. It's the only way I see it." Elk Wheaton shrugged his large shoulders nonchalantly and tugged at his large wispy beard. His eyes looked deeply reflective. Finally he said,
"That's the problem for many retirees these days. I've seen it with some of my friends, you know. They leave their careers behind to retire, and then they have nothing to do, and their lives become somewhat starched by routine and drudgerously boring. And me and your mother, we don't want that. We are in for the time of our lives moving to Alaska, and we're going to embrace this adventure with an impassioned enthusiasm."
"Dad, I sincerely hope it's going to work out for you and Mum," Zelda had said, unable to hide the tentative concern that was creeping up in her voice. "I just hope the two of you aren't making a grievous mistake, that's all. One that you're going to live to regret. You do know, Dad, that Alaska has a high suicide rate, an excess of drinking and drug problems. Some people can't handle all that ongoing cold weather. It depresses them so much, so they medicate themselves with drugs and alcohol. Then there are all those people that go missing in Alaska every year. You mustn't forget about that. They disappear for reasons unknown, but they're never ever seen again, especially people who live in remote parts of the wilderness near the Alaskan Triangle. What if you were to become one of those stats, Dad, and you and Mum vanish, like so many have done, never to be seen again? When you're living in the middle of nowhere, anything could happen to you, and no one will be able to come to your rescue if things go badly awry. It's not like living here in Chestnut Hill, Dad, where you can easily pick up the phone at a moment's notice to call for help. You can even call on your neighbours. But out there you're on your own, in a lonely, sequestered part of the wilderness where anything can happen. Think about that for a moment, Dad.
My word, Zelda. I hope you don't talk to your patients like you're talking to us,
said Elk, looking visibly quite affronted by his daughter's off-the-cuff, rather stinging remarks.
Honestly, love, you sound as if you've just told me and your poor mother that we've got terminal cancer and only weeks to live. You should learn to be a little bit more optimistic and upbeat, love. We didn't raise you to be a perennial pessimist like this, but maybe that's what sending you to good schools has done. Those teachers have taught you to see the dark side of every cloud instead of the silver lining. I rather suspect that that may be the case. For your information, me and your mother have no intention of going missing. We may be moving to the Alaskan wilderness, but we're not stupid. We're well aware of what goes on in Alaska with all the missing people. But as long as we have our wits about us, we should be fine.
I resent you suggesting I'm being a pessimist, Dad, Zelda had insisted. I'm being what is known as extremely forthright and very realistic. I just want you and Mum to know what you're getting yourselves into before you come running back to Chestnut Hill with your tail between your legs, feeling a tad foolish for taking on more than you can chew. You're not as young as you used to be, Dad, I might remind you. So the things you were easily able to do when you're younger are going to be a lot more taxing now. Besides, in my experience working in the ER with older people that sometimes come in after a nasty fall, I've noticed more of them are intolerant to the cold. And some of those winters in Alaska, with temperatures dropping well below zero, well, they're not going to be pleasant, Dad, and definitely not plain sailing.
We are well aware of the cold weather in Alaska, love, during the winter season, Elk had responded. Me and your mother have prepared ourselves for that. We're not going to Alaska with our eyes half closed. We know exactly what we're doing and what we're taking on.
Well, I hope to God you do, Dad, Zelda had said. Maybe you're right. Maybe I am being pessimistic about all this. But if you saw the amount of people that come through accident and emergency on an evening, when they're rushed into hospital, requiring life-saving procedures, it's hard to see the world with a rosy glow. Every single day of my life, when I work with patients in the ER, some who don't make it, I'm always reminded of how desperately fragile life is. How we can be here 1 minute and gone the next. Death is no respecter of persons or of age, Dad. And that frightens me a lot.
But of course it does, love. But you see death every day, don't you? It's your job to work with people in life-threatening situations that don't always end up well. But don't allow your job to cloud your judgment when it comes to me and your mother. Apart from anything else, you point out very wisely that life is fragile. But it's also pretty pointless to live your life in perennial fear, for you'll end up like a sweaty ham sandwich wrapped up in cling film all the time. Life is for the living, and me and your mother have had life good so far. If we dropped down dead tomorrow, I wouldn't have anything to complain about, because my life has been amazing. But if God gives me the grace to enjoy another 20 or 30 years, I'd like to spend that part of my life in the wilds of Alaska, living out in nature, because it makes me feel alive. Look how me and your mother would light up on every holiday we went on, which invited us to challenge ourselves. I'm sure you must have memories of that.
Zelda rolled her eyes in the back of her head in exasperation. You can say that again, Dad. You've always loved living on the edge.
You always seem to welcome that, don't you? I've never understood it."
"Well, there you go then, love. You've answered your own question. Me and your mother shan't be coming back to Pennsylvania," he had said firmly, almost gritting his teeth together. "If you want to talk about harbouring doubts, you're not alone on that front, Zelda. If you must know, the difference between me and your mother, when it comes to doubting, is we haven't tried to tear you down by expressing our misgivings. Instead, we've kept such thoughts to ourselves."
"So what are you saying, Dad, exactly? That you've had doubts about me?" asked Zelda, looking very surprised. "What have I done that you've doubted, Dad?" she challenged her father. Zelda Wheaton prided herself in believing that every decision she made was saliently wise, but not everyone would have agreed with that, especially not her parents, but they had been far too polite and somewhat reticent to express any misgivings on their daughter's part. But in this quintessential moment, when emotions were lying unambiguously bare, Elk suddenly felt his daughter needed to know some home truths, so he answered her question without trying to duck for cover. He shrugged his shoulders nonchalantly to make light of the situation, with gestures that defined a light-hearted body language, but all the while he was meeting his daughter's steely, somewhat fiery gaze head-on. It was almost as if Zelda's eyes were saying, "Go on, I dare you, Dad." But Elk was not remotely intimidated by his daughter's challenging look.
"I'm going to level with you, love, as you have with us. If you must know, me and your mother were cynical when you first announced that you had got a perfect stranger that you met in a bar to impregnate you with his sperm so that you could have a baby. When you told us that story, love, I won't kid, it threw us for six, it really did. I know we acted very accepting about it, but what you told us was very difficult to digest, as any sane parent would likely feel the same. We had hoped you'd settle down and get married before you thought of having children."
"But if you felt like that, Dad, why the hell didn't you tell me?" Zelda demanded. "Why would you be so polite to me? I'm your daughter, for God's sake. If you didn't like what I'd done, why not say it, rather than dig your head in the sand and just shut your lips?"
"What was the point in saying anything, Zelda?" said Elk Wheaton, shaking his head. "The deed had been done, had it not? It's like when a storm brings down a tree during the night. What are you going to do, harp on and on about the damage? What's the point in that? It's too late for that. You're going to have to accept what has happened and get on with cleaning up the mess."
"So is that what you viewed me, getting pregnant with Karen, as? A mess, is that it? You think I messed up getting pregnant, going down a rather unconventional route?"
"I didn't say that, love. Don't take offence. It is what it is. Me and your mother thought you had made a foolish decision at the time, because you were raising a child without a father. But it turns out your having Karen was the best decision of your life, and you know why it worked out for you."
Zelda Wheaton sighed. "No, Dad, but I'm sure you're going to enlighten me like you always do. Go on, bring it on, let's hear it, shall we?"
"There's no need to be sarcastic, love. It doesn't suit you. If you must know why I think it was a good decision in the end, it was because you knew it was right for you. You wanted a baby, Zelda, more than anything else in the world, and I understand that completely. Just like me and your mother have always wanted to move to the Alaskan wilderness. It's the same thing. At the time, of course, you hadn't met the right man, and you knew your biological clock was ticking. So you made some rather unorthodox decisions. You were worried that your eggs were getting too old. And so when you went to a bar one night, you walked up to a perfect stranger and said,
"I don't know you, but you're wretchedly handsome, if you don't mind my saying so, and I'm looking for a sperm donor. Are you willing to help me out?"
And he said yes. And then voila, 9 months later you had little Karen. And even though the father was a stranger, willing to donate his sperm to you, me and your mother believe you made the right decision in the end. For one thing we have been blessed with is the most wonderful granddaughter."
"Of course I made the right decision," said Zelda. "Honestly, Dad, I hadn't met anyone, had I, that I'd want to settle down with.
and I wanted a baby desperately. I went up to a random guy in a bar, yes, that's true. But credit me with some common sense, will you? I did ask the stranger very significant questions about his family history, with heart disease and cancer and all that. I'm a doctor, so that's what I do. I don't want to be impregnated by someone with a family history of mental illness or cancer, because my baby could end up inheriting those challenging genes. I had to be pragmatic about it all, and take my project seriously. It turned out that the handsome stranger's grandparents had lived into their late 90s. I asked if he was willing to help me out, because I didn't want to go down the route of going to a fertility clinic with all that fuss. So this generous man agreed to provide me with some of his sperm. I didn't even know his name, and I couldn't even look him up in the future even if I wanted to do so. But that was what we both wanted in this agreement, so it worked out just fine in the end for all parties concerned. I'm just very surprised the man agreed to do all this, Dora Wheaton had pointed out, as she peeled potatoes at the kitchen sink, while listening to her daughter talking to her father. She looked up at her daughter from the potatoes she was peeling and said, "To tell you the truth, Zelda, I just can't imagine many men wanting to sire a child with a strange woman such as yourself, and agree to never see that child again. I agree with your father on this one, that baby Karen is the best thing that has ever happened to our family. But what are you going to do when Karen gets older and asks about her real biological father? Have you even thought about that?" "Of course I've thought about that, Mum. I will tell Karen the story about how she came into being when she's old enough to understand about it," Zelda had said. "I wanted a baby, Mum. I saw a handsome, very good-looking, attractive man in the bar. I asked him some medical questions. He answered those for me, and then agreed to impregnate me with some of his sperm, so that I could have a baby. Why should that be remotely upsetting to my little girl? She'll always know she was badly wanted by me, that I went to extreme measures on her account to ensure that she would be born." "But her father, dear, was just a sperm donor, nothing more and nothing less," said Dora. "I mean, think about it. Your little girl will never know the pleasure of having a father, because this man never wanted her. He was doing you a favour, but he has no interest in developing a relationship with your little girl. And I think that's desperately sad, for every child needs a father as far as I'm concerned." Zelda had sighed. "Sorry, Dad, and sorry, Mum. I hate to say this to the both of you, I really do. But you do see the world through a very limited, old-fashioned lens, if you don't mind my saying so. Just so you know, nowadays it's common for lots of women to be artificially inseminated with a stranger's sperm. I did the same thing. But I used a turkey baster. What's wrong with that? Their children grow up to be just fine, thank you very much, as will mine." "If you say so, dear," Dora had said, knowing that her daughter saw the world through a very scientific lens. It hadn't surprised her remotely that Zelda had gone up to a random stranger in a bar and asked him all about his medical history, and then invited him very cordially to donate some of his sperm to her, so that she could impregnate herself with a turkey baster. Still, Dora thought to herself, Zelda was nothing short of ingenious like that, for she had bypassed the middleman at the fertility clinic, doing things in a very practical, no-nonsense, rough-and-ready way. That is ironically how many things may sometimes be done in Alaska, if you're living off-grid, that is. Still, it had turned out well in the end, so much so that when Karen got a little older, Zelda informed her little girl about how she came into being, and Karen didn't appear to mind at all. In fact, it made her feel special, because her mother had selected her father over and above anybody else. So even though she'd never get to meet him, she knew he had to be special. But it might have still been very nice to get to know her father. Dora couldn't help but privately harbour some big regrets, for she would have liked her fiercely independent daughter Zelda to have met a very nice man to settle down with. But the fact that this had never happened did not altogether surprise Dora, for she knew all too well that Zelda could be full on, and would likely want to wear the pants in her family. So whoever she married would likely have to live in her shadow, and let's just say no self-respecting man wants to do that.
Zelda often frequently asked her mother what it was about her that made men shy away from her, and always failed to make any form of commitment. "I'm attractive, aren't I, Mum?" she had asked frequently. "What's wrong with me? When a man gets to know me, he suddenly loses interest fast. What am I doing wrong?" Dora wanted to tell her daughter that her dominant, overbearing, rather bossy attitude towards everything, and the way she often ordered people around like she did in the ER, were not exactly the attributes a man was looking for in a relationship with a woman, for no man wants to feel demasculated. She knew that Zelda more than lightly intimidated the men she met. She was so damn headstrong and opinionated. Dora could see her husband Elk in her daughter all too clearly, but no man in his right mind would want to be married to a woman that displayed the same indomitable characteristics of her husband Elk. Karen Wheaton's mother Zelda loved her job in accident and emergency. She was efficient and organised in everything she did, holding her own in some of the most grisly, life-threatening situations that were not for the faint of heart by any manner of means. She was the kind of unflustered, stoic woman who never panicked in a crisis, even when the patient in question had gone into a full-blown cardiac arrest. Zelda would take control of the situation so breezily, so much so that all the staff she worked with remained calm and collected throughout the procedures, thanks to Zelda's very serene attitude. These remarkable attributes that Zelda possessed meant that many patients had been brought back from the brink of death. Dora was sure her daughter's success in the ER was because she never panicked in very tense situations that could so easily go badly awry. So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.